The temperature had dropped so severely that breath froze in the air before dissipating, and the lake beyond the trading post had transformed into a vast sheet of ice that cracked and groaned with sounds like distant thunder. Inside the crude wooden structure, a man huddled near his failing fire, rationing the last of his firewood and wondering if he made a fatal mistake choosing to winter in this isolated location. His supplies were running dangerously low. His trap lines had produced almost nothing for weeks, and the brutal cold showed no signs of breaking. He had endured difficult seasons before, but this winter felt different. Felt like nature itself had decided to test how much suffering a human could withstand before breaking completely. What he could not know was that by morning, his concerns about cold and hunger would seem trivial compared to the impossible situation awaiting him, that a single choice made in darkness would bring an army to his doorstep and force him to navigate cultural complexities that could end his life as easily as any blizzard. If stories about unexpected consequences and the courage to face impossible situations resonate with you, consider subscribing to discover how one act of compassion can change everything. The winter of 1764 punished the Lake Champlain region with ferocity that old-timers claimed they had never witnessed. Snow had fallen almost continuously since November, burying the landscape under drifts that made travel treacherous and game animals scarce as they huddled in whatever shelter they could find. The few trappers and traders who worked this remote territory had either retreated to established settlements or dug in at their posts to wait out the worst, gambling that their supplies would last until spring thaw made movement possible again. The man struggling to maintain his fire was named Marcus Webb, 31 years old, a solitary trader who had established a small post 3 years earlier in hopes of intercepting furs before they reached larger trading centers. His strategy had worked reasonably well during good seasons, but this winter had exposed the vulnerability of his isolated position. He was too far from help if disaster struck, too dependent on regular resupply that had become impossible once the snow started, too stubborn to abandon his investment and retreat to safety while he still could have managed the journey. Marcus had grown up in Massachusetts, the youngest son of a shopkeeper who had no inheritance to offer him and limited patience for a boy who preferred solitude to social interaction. He had drifted westward in his early 20s, trying various professions before discovering that trading suited his temperament better than most occupations. He liked the independence, the direct negotiations without complex social hierarchies, the long periods alone that others found unbearable, but he found peaceful. His post had become his entire world, and the thought of losing it to this brutal winter filled him with desperate determination to survive regardless of hardship. On this particular night, Marcus had reduced his fire to barely more than embers, trying to stretch his remaining wood through one more day while hoping the temperature might moderate enough to make gathering more fuel possible. He had eaten a meager supper, the last of his dried beans, and was preparing to wrap himself in every blanket and fur he possessed when he heard a sound that made him freeze in confusion. It was unmistakably a baby crying, the thin wail cutting through the wind noise with heartbreaking clarity. Marcus told himself he was hallucinating, that exhaustion and cold were creating auditory illusions, that no infant could possibly be out in this frozen wasteland miles from any settlement. But the crying continued, growing more desperate, and he felt his heart begin to pound with a mixture of disbelief and rising alarm. He grabbed his rifle and a lantern, wrapping himself in his heaviest coat, and pushed out into the bitter night to investigate what had been impossible. The crying led him around the side of his trading post to where supplies were typically stacked during better weather. There, partially buried in a snowdrift and wrapped in a single deerskin that offered inadequate protection from the killing cold, lay an infant that could not have been more than a few months old. The baby's lips were blue, its tiny fists waving weakly, its cries becoming fainter as hypothermia advanced. Marcus stared in complete shock for several seconds, his mind refusing to process this impossibility, before training and basic humanity overrode his paralysis. He scooped up the freezing child and rushed back inside, kicking the door shut behind him and immediately adding precious wood to his fire to raise the temperature. The baby was terrifyingly cold to the touch, its skin like ice, and Marcus had no experience with infants, but understood that warming needed to happen gradually to avoid shock. He stripped off his own shirt and held the child against his bare chest, wrapping them both in blankets, using his body heat to slowly raise the infant's core temperature while praying he was not already too late. The baby's crying had stopped, which Marcus knew could be a very bad sign. He rubbed the tiny limbs gently, trying to stimulate circulation, and spoke softly in what he hoped was a soothing tone despite his own panic. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness, and just as Marcus began to fear the worst, the infant drew a deeper breath and released a stronger cry that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The child was alive, was warming, was going to survive if he could maintain the right conditions. As the immediate crisis passed and Marcus's heart rate began to settle, his mind turned to the overwhelming questions the situation raised. Where had this baby come from? The nearest Mohican village was at least 15 miles away, and he knew of no settler families within twice that distance. How had an infant ended up abandoned outside his trading post in the middle of a blizzard? Had the parents died trying to reach his post for help? Had the baby been deliberately left? And if so, why here and why in such a manner that almost guaranteed death? The child appeared to be Mohican based on coloring and features, dressed in traditional wrappings beneath the inadequate deerskin covering. Marcus examined the baby more carefully now that warming had progressed, checking for injuries or obvious illness, finding nothing except the effect of cold exposure. The infant was thin, suggesting inadequate feeding for some time, but otherwise seemed healthy enough. As warmth returned, the baby's eyes opened, dark and alert, studying Marcus with an intensity that seemed almost adult in its focus. Marcus had no milk or appropriate food for an infant. His supplies consisted entirely of items suited for adult consumption, and he had no knowledge of how to care for something so small and fragile. Yet he could not simply let the child die after saving it from freezing, and he had no way to transport an infant to civilization through 15 miles of deadly winter conditions. He was trapped in an impossible situation, responsible for a life he had no ability to properly sustain, with no clear path forward except try and keep them both alive until spring thaw made seeking help possible. Marcus spent the remainder of that night in a state of anxious vigilance, holding the infant close and monitoring its breathing, terrified that despite his efforts the child might still succumb to the exposure it had endured. He tried various improvised solutions for feeding, eventually managing to get the baby to accept small amounts of water mixed with a tiny bit of honey, which was far from adequate nutrition, but better than nothing. The infant alternated between fitful sleep and periods of fussy wakefulness, clearly hungry and uncomfortable but alive, and Marcus counted each hour survived as a small victory against impossible odds. As gray dawn light began filtering through the gaps in his trading post walls, Marcus finally allowed himself to believe the baby would survive the immediate crisis. He had kept the fire burning steadily throughout the night, depleting his supply to dangerous levels, but prioritizing the infant's warmth over his own future needs. The child was breathing normally now, its color improved, its movement stronger, and Marcus felt profound relief mixed with renewed anxiety about the long-term sustainability of the situation. He needed real food for the baby, needed proper supplies, needed knowledge he simply did not possess about infant care. Marcus laid the sleeping child carefully in a makeshift bed he had created from folded blankets near the fire, then moved to a small window to assess the morning conditions. What he saw made his blood turn to ice in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. His trading post was completely surrounded by Mohican warriors, at least 150 men standing in absolute silence in a massive circle that extended in all directions. They were armed with rifles, bows, tomahawks, and knives, their faces painted for war, their stance suggesting readiness for immediate violence. They simply stood there, motionless as trees, watching his post with an intensity that was far more terrifying than any aggressive advance would have been. Marcus stumbled backward from the window, his heart hammering so violently he thought it might burst from his chest. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to understand what was happening and what it meant. Had they come for the baby? Were they here to punish him for some violation he did not understand? Was this about the infant or about something else entirely? Some territorial dispute or perceived insult he had committed unknowingly? The silence outside felt more menacing than battle cries would have been, suggesting a level of organization and purpose that spoke to serious intent rather than spontaneous aggression. He checked his rifle and pistol, ensuring both were loaded, knowing even as he did so that weapons were completely irrelevant against such overwhelming numbers. If these warriors intended to kill him, he would die regardless of how well armed he might be. Barricading himself inside would only delay the inevitable, and fighting would guarantee a violent end. Yet surrender carried its own risks in a situation he could not begin to comprehend. Marcus had traded peacefully with various Mohican bands over the years, had always dealt fairly and respectfully, but he knew that frontier politics were complex and that innocence of wrongdoing meant nothing if he had somehow become entangled in conflicts beyond his understanding. The baby stirred and began to cry, the sound impossibly loud in the tense silence. Marcus rushed to pick up the infant, rocking gently and trying to provide comfort, while his own fear threatened to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. He needed to make a decision quickly, needed to determine whether staying inside or going out to face whatever awaited him offered better chances of survival. The warriors had not attacked during the night, when he would have been most vulnerable, which suggested they wanted something other than simple violence, but he could not guess what that might be. After several agonizing minutes of internal debate, Marcus made his choice. Hiding inside would solve nothing and might be interpreted as cowardice or guilt. Whatever had brought these warriors to his post, whatever this was about, he needed to face it directly and hope that honesty and respect might count for something. He wrapped the baby securely in warm blankets, checked that his fire was safely contained, and took a deep breath to steady his shaking hands. Then he opened his door and stepped out into the freezing morning, holding the infant carefully and keeping his hands clearly visible and away from weapons. The wall of warriors parted silently to create a path, and through this opening came an elderly man whose bearing and elaborate dress marked him as someone of great importance. He was accompanied by a younger warrior who appeared to serve as both translator and bodyguard, and by a woman whose grief-stricken face and reaching arms toward the baby made Marcus suddenly understand at least part of what was happening. This was the child's mother, and these warriors had come to reclaim what had been taken or lost. The elder spoke at length in Mohican, his voice carrying across the frozen clearing with authority that commanded absolute attention. The younger warrior translated into heavily accented but comprehensible English, and what Marcus heard made him understand he had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple case of a lost child. The baby was named Kichi, the translator explained, and he was the subject of a prophecy that had torn the community apart with controversy and painful decisions. According to their sacred traditions, the elder continued through translation. A child born during the winter solstice with certain specific markings was destined to bring either great fortune or terrible catastrophe to the people. The prophecy was ancient and had appeared in their oral histories only twice before, each time preceding periods of massive change for the Mohican nation. When Kichi was born with the prophesied markings, the tribal council had debated for weeks about what should be done, with some arguing the child must be honored and protected, while others insisted he should be exposed to the elements as tradition demanded for such ominous signs. The decision had finally been made to follow the old ways, to place the infant in a sacred location, and allow the spirits to determine his fate. If he survived through supernatural intervention, it would prove he was meant to bring fortune, and the people would raise him with great honor. If he died, it would spare them from catastrophe his survival might bring. The mother had fought this decision desperately, but had been overruled by the council of elders who insisted that individual desires could not supersede the welfare of the entire community, facing such a momentous prophecy. Marcus listened with growing horror and understanding. The baby had not been accidentally lost or abandoned by dying parents, but deliberately placed outside his trading post as part of a sacred ritual. By bringing Kichi inside and saving him from exposure, Marcus had interfered with profound religious practice, had inserted himself into tribal affairs in ways that violated both custom and spiritual law. The warriors had surrounded his post not to attack, but to bear witness, to see what the white trader who had disrupted their ceremony would do next, to determine whether his actions were hostile or ignorant, malicious or simply misguided. The elder asked directly, through his translator, why Marcus had taken the child. Did he understand what he had done? Did he seek to insult their traditions or profit from possessing a baby of prophecy? Was he working for enemies who wanted to steal their sacred child for dark purposes? The questions came rapid fire, each one suggesting different possible interpretations of Marcus's actions, and he realized that his answer needed to be both truthful and carefully articulated to avoid catastrophic misunderstanding. Marcus chose his words with extreme care, aware that 150 armed warriors were listening to every syllable, that the infant's mother was watching him with desperate hope, and that his response would determine whether he lived or died in the next few minutes. He explained that he had heard crying in the night, that he had found the baby freezing to death in the snow, and that he had acted purely on instinct to save a life without any knowledge of prophecies or sacred rituals. He stated plainly that he meant no disrespect to Mohican traditions, that his ignorance was complete and genuine, and that he had simply done what any decent person would do when confronted with a dying infant regardless of whose child it might be. He acknowledged that his interference had clearly violated important customs he did not understand, and he expressed willingness to face consequences for that violation. But he also said with quiet firmness that he could not regret saving a child's life, that whatever spiritual significance Kitchi might hold, he was first and foremost a helpless baby who would have died in agony without intervention. Marcus met the elder's eyes directly as he spoke, showing respect but not cowering, demonstrating that his actions came from conviction rather than carelessness. The elder listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Marcus finished, a tense silence followed that seemed to stretch for an eternity. The Mohican leader consulted quietly with several other elders who had moved forward to join the discussion, their conversation too low and too rapid for Marcus to catch even if he had understood their language. The baby's mother remained frozen in place, tears streaming down her face, her entire being focused on the child in Marcus's arms with an intensity of longing that transcended any language barrier. Finally, the elder spoke again, and the translator conveyed words that Marcus had not anticipated. The fact that the white trader had saved Kitchi despite the deadly cold and at personal cost, using his last resources to warm and feed the child, was itself a form of divine intervention that the prophecy had anticipated. The spirits had not acted directly, but had worked through this unexpected instrument, this foreign man who knew nothing of their ways, but who possessed compassion to act when confronted with suffering. This changed everything, the elder declared, because it suggested the prophecy was unfolding in ways that demanded new interpretation. The council would need to deliberate on what Marcus's involvement meant for their understanding of Kitchi's destiny. But the immediate decision was that the child would be returned to his mother, who had suffered enough grief, and that Marcus would be honored rather than punished for his role in preserving a life the spirits apparently intended to continue. However, the elder continued with grave emphasis. Marcus had become bound to Kitchi's fate through his intervention, had made himself part of the prophecy whether he wished it or not, and that connection carried responsibilities he could not simply walk away from. Marcus felt relief wash over him so powerfully that his legs nearly buckled. He was not going to die this morning, was not going to be punished for saving a baby's life, and the warriors surrounding his post were apparently there as witnesses rather than executioners. But the elder's final words troubled him, this suggestion that he had somehow become entangled in tribal affairs in permanent ways. He asked carefully what responsibilities the elder meant, what obligations he had supposedly incurred by bringing Kitchi inside and warming him by his fire. The translation came slowly, as if the young warrior was choosing English words carefully to convey complex concepts. Marcus had demonstrated that he valued Mohican life, that he would sacrifice his own resources to save their children, that he acted with honor when tested unknowingly. This made him trustworthy in ways that words could never establish, and trust was precious in an era when violence and betrayal characterized most interactions between their peoples. The community wanted Marcus to serve as a bridge, to maintain connection between their village and the wider trading networks, to act as an advocate who understood their humanity because he had held one of their infants and chosen life over indifference. More immediately, the elder explained, Marcus lacked the supplies needed to survive the remainder of winter in his isolated post. His intervention to save Kitchi had depleted his resources to dangerous levels, and leaving him to starve or freeze after he had shown such compassion would be dishonorable. Therefore, the warriors had brought provisions, food and firewood, and other necessities that would see him through to spring thaw. This was not charity but reciprocity, payment for the life dead incurred when he saved their prophesied child, and acceptance would seal the relationship being offered. Marcus looked at the baby in his arms, at the mother whose face had transformed from grief to desperate hope, at the circle of warriors who had come not to kill but to judge, and apparently to reward. He thought about the incomprehensible complexity of the situation he had stumbled into, about prophecies and sacred rituals that seemed like superstition to his European mind, but clearly held profound meaning for these people. He considered the offer being made, this invitation to become something more than a simple trader conducting transactions, to be woven into community in ways that carried both privilege and obligation. He asked if he could approach the mother to return her child, and the elder nodded permission. Marcus walked slowly across the snow, acutely aware of every eye upon him, and stopped before the woman who had been forced to abandon her baby to satisfy tradition. He spoke softly, knowing she likely understood a little English, but hoping tone would convey what words could not, telling her that Kitchi was strong and brave, that it fought to survive, that she should be proud of such a resilient son. Then he placed the infant carefully into her outstretched arms and stepped back to give her space for reunion. The woman clutched Kitchi to her chest, her entire body shaking with sobs of relief and joy. She spoke rapidly in Mohican, words Marcus could not understand but whose emotional content needed no translation. Other women had moved forward to surround her, offering support and celebration, while the warriors remained in their positions but with visible relaxation in their stance, suggesting crisis had been averted and acceptable resolution achieved. The elder watched the reunion with satisfaction, then turned back to Marcus and spoke words that were translated as formal acceptance of the bond now established. Over the next several hours, the warriors unloaded supplies they carried to Marcus's trading post, stacking firewood that would last months, providing smoked meats and dried corn and other preserved foods in quantities that seemed excessive until Marcus understood they were also restocking his trading goods so he could resume business when weather permitted. They worked with efficient coordination, transforming his depleted post back into a viable operation, and several men took time to repair structural damage and improve insulation that Marcus had been unable to address alone. The elder remained throughout this process, sitting by Marcus's fire and speaking to the translator about many things. He explained more about the prophecies surrounding Kitchi, about the fears and hopes it had generated within the community, about the difficult balance between honoring tradition and adapting to changing circumstances. He spoke of the pressures their people faced as colonial expansion continued relentlessly, of villages displaced and populations decimated by disease, of the desperate need for allies who saw them as human rather than obstacles to be eliminated. Marcus listened and learned, beginning to understand the broader context into which he had accidentally inserted himself. The Mohican people were fighting for survival, trying to maintain identity and autonomy in the face of overwhelming forces that sought to erase them. Prophecies and sacred traditions were not mere superstition, but anchors of meaning in a world that had become chaotic and threatening, ways of asserting that their interpretations of events mattered and their spiritual understanding had validity despite European dismissal of native beliefs as primitive nonsense. As evening approached and the warriors prepared to depart, the elder made Marcus a formal offer that carried weight beyond simple words. He invited the trader to visit their village when spring arrived, to meet the community properly and to witness how Kitchi was being raised as the prophesied child whose life had been preserved through unexpected intervention. The elder emphasized that Marcus's role in the prophecies unfolding made him significant to their people's story, that his name would be remembered in their oral histories as the outsider who chose compassion over convenience, and that such recognition came with both honor and ongoing connection. Marcus accepted the invitation, understanding that refusal will be interpreted as rejection of the relationship being offered. He asked questions about appropriate protocols for such a visit, about what gifts would be respectful to bring, about how to conduct himself in ways that honored their customs rather than inadvertently insulting them. The elder seemed pleased by these inquiries, stating that a willingness to learn demonstrated wisdom that many white men lacked, and he provided detailed guidance about proper behavior and meaningful gestures that would be appreciated. Before leaving, the baby's mother approached Marcus one final time, through the translator. She thanked him with words that carried profound emotion, saying that he had given her back not just her son, but her will to continue living, that she had been prepared to die from grief if Kitchi perished, and that his kindness had saved 2 lives rather than 1. She presented him with a small beaded pouch she had created, explaining it contained sacred herbs for protection and healing, a gift made with her own hands to express gratitude that exceeded any material payment. Marcus accepted the pouch with deep respect, moved by the gesture and by the tears still glistening on her face. He told her through translation that he hoped Kitchi would grow strong and bring the fortune the prophecy promised, that any small role he had played in preserving the child's life was privilege rather than burden, and that he looked forward to seeing the boy again when spring made travel possible. The mother touched Marcus's hand briefly, a gesture that crossed cultural boundaries to convey connection between 2 people who had shared an intense experience that neither would forget. The warriors departed as silently as they had arrived, melting into the forest with practiced ease despite their numbers, leaving Marcus standing alone outside his trading post watching them disappear. The contrast between the terror he had felt at dawn and the strange peace he felt now was almost disorienting. His post was stocked with supplies that would sustain him comfortably through the remainder of winter. He had forged an unexpected alliance with a native community that could prove invaluable for future trade, and he had apparently become part of prophecy whose full implications he could not begin to understand. The rest of that winter passed in relative comfort, thanks to the provisions the Mohicans had provided. Marcus had time to reflect extensively on everything that had transpired, on the series of accidents and choices that had led to that moment when he heard a baby crying in the snow. He thought about how easily he might have convinced himself the sound was imagination or wind, how he might have decided that investigating was too dangerous given the brutal cold, how different everything would be if he had made any choice other than the one he did. He also contemplated the prophecy itself and what his role in it might ultimately mean. Marcus was not a religious man in conventional terms, his faith worn thin by years of hardship and disappointment, but he could not dismiss the profound significance these events held for the Mohican people. Whether Kitchi was truly destined for greatness or catastrophe, whether prophecies had any validity beyond the meaning people chose to assign them, seemed less important than the fact that an entire community organized their understanding around such frameworks, and that respect required engaging with their worldview on its own terms rather than dismissing it as primitive superstition. When spring finally arrived and the ice began breaking up on the lake, Marcus prepared for his promised visit to the Mohican village. He selected his best trade goods as gifts, including steel knives and colorful cloth and other items he knew would be valued. He spent time practicing the Mohican phrases the translator had taught him, wanted to demonstrate effort to communicate in their language rather than expecting them to always accommodate his English. He was nervous about the visit, uncertain what to expect, and worried about committing some inadvertent offense, but also genuinely curious to see Kitchi again and to learn more about the people whose lives had become unexpectedly intertwined with his own. The village welcomed Marcus with ceremony that both honored and slightly overwhelmed him. He was introduced to the entire community, presented formally to the Council of Elders, and treated with a respect that exceeded what he had experienced in most settler contexts despite his years of honest trading. Kitchi had grown in a month since that frozen night, had become a healthy, alert infant who studied Marcus with intense dark eyes that seemed to recognize him despite the impossibility of genuine memory at such a young age. The mother, whose name Marcus learned was Winetta, had prepared a feast in his honor, and during the meal she recounted the story of that night to the assembled community. Her telling emphasized details Marcus had not fully appreciated, how low his own supplies had been when he chose to deplete them further to save an unknown child, how he had used his own body heat when adding wood to his fire, how he had tried desperately to feed Kitchi despite having no appropriate food. Her narrative transformed his actions from simple decency into profound sacrifice, and Marcus felt uncomfortable with the heroic framing, but understood that allowing her this interpretation was itself a form of respect. Over the following years, Marcus became a regular visitor to the Mohican village, his trading post serving as a crucial link between their community and the broader colonial economy. He negotiated fair prices for their furs and crafts, warned them about dishonest traders, and occasionally acted as informal mediator when disputes arose with settler neighbors. His unique position as an outsider who had earned genuine trust made him valuable to both sides, and he took seriously the responsibility that came with that role. He watched Kitchi grow from infant to child, observing the special attention the boy received as the subject of prophecy. The child showed unusual intelligence and calm temperament, and whether this was due to inherent qualities or the expectations placed upon him was impossible to determine. The community invested enormous hope in Kitchi, seeing in him the possibility of revitalization for a people who had suffered devastating losses, and Marcus understood that the pressure on this child was immense regardless of whatever destiny he might actually fulfill. Marcus never married, never established a family he had vaguely imagined in his youth, but he came to understand that connection and community took many forms beyond traditional domestic arrangements. His relationship with the Mohican village became central to his identity, giving him purpose that extended beyond mere survival or profit accumulation. He was present for important ceremonies, consulted on matters where his outside perspective might prove valuable, and treated as an honorary member of the community, despite remaining fundamentally an outsider, who returned to his trading post rather than living among them permanently. As the years advanced and colonial pressure on native territories intensified, Marcus's role as bridge between worlds became increasingly important and increasingly difficult. He witnessed injustices he could not prevent, saw communities displaced by policies that violated every treaty and promise, and struggled with the moral complexity of benefiting from a trading system that was simultaneously destroying the people he had come to care about. There were no simple answers, no clear paths that did not involve compromise and complicity, and he did the best he could within systems he had not created but could not escape. When Marcus was in his 50s and Kitchi had grown into a young man of 20, the prophecy's ultimate meaning began revealing itself in ways no one had anticipated. Kitchi had become a powerful voice for adaptation and survival, arguing that his people needed to selectively adopt useful technologies and practices from European culture while maintaining core values and identity. This position was controversial, opposed by traditionalists who saw any accommodation as betrayal, and by militants who insisted only armed resistance could preserve their autonomy. But Kitchi's prophecy gave him authority that allowed his voice to be heard even by those who disagreed with his conclusions. He pointed to Marcus as living proof that not all colonists were enemies, that individual relationships could create understanding even within broader contexts of conflict, and that strategic alliances with sympathetic outsiders might provide advantages that isolation could not offer. His arguments did not convince everyone, but they created space for pragmatic approaches that helped some communities navigate the devastating changes sweeping across their territories. Marcus understood that it had become a symbol within Kitchi's narrative, that the story of the white trader who saved the prophesied child had been refined through countless retellings into something larger than the actual events warranted. He was uncomfortable with this mythologizing, but recognized that his discomfort was less important than the purposes the story served for people fighting for cultural survival. If his actions at Frozen Night could provide hope or justification for strategies that might preserve some version of Mohican identity into the future, then the distortion of his motives and character was a small price to pay. In his final years, as age and declining health made operating his trading post increasingly difficult, Marcus sold the property and moved to a small cabin near the Mohican village where he had become so deeply connected. He spent his remaining time teaching English to children who would need that skill to navigate the colonial world, recording stories and oral histories that elders feared would be lost, and serving as living memory of a time when two very different peoples had managed to find common ground through shared humanity and mutual respect. When Marcus died at 71, the Mohican community mourned him with ceremonies typically reserved for their own honored elders. Kitchi, by then a middle-aged leader himself, spoke at length about the profound impact one man's simple choice had created, how saving a freezing infant had initiated connections that influenced decades of history, how compassion in a critical moment could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict or measure. He emphasized that Marcus had never sought recognition or reward, had simply acted according to values he believed in, and that such integrity was a foundation upon which trust and genuine relationship could be built. The story of Marcus and Kitchi became one of those narratives that persisted in regional oral traditions, told in various forms by both native peoples and settlers' descendants who recognized in it something essential about human potential for connection across vast cultural divides. Some versions emphasize the prophecy in spiritual dimensions, others focus on practical alliance and mutual benefit, but all retain the core truth that a man who heard a baby cry in the snow had chosen to act rather than ignore, and that choice had mattered in ways that extended far beyond that single frozen night. Thank you for watching this powerful story about how one moment of compassion can change the course of history and create connections that transcend cultural boundaries. If this tale moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to never miss another story about courage, humanity, and the unexpected consequences of choosing kindness over indifference. Give us a thumbs up if you believe that individual actions matter even within larger systems that seem overwhelming and unchangeable. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement to act with compassion when faced with suffering, even when that action seems small or unlikely to make a difference. Leave a comment telling us about times when simple human decency created unexpected connections, or about moments when you chose to help despite uncertainty about consequences. Your stories build a community committed to recognizing that we are all connected, that every act of kindness creates possibilities that extend beyond what we can see, and that being fully human means responding to suffering regardless of whose life hangs in the balance. Until next time, remember that you never know when a simple choice to act with compassion might become the beginning of something far larger than you could imagine. That saving one life can create ripples that touch countless others, and that sometimes the most profound impacts come from the most straightforward decisions to simply do what is right.